Hello, this is Helen Thomas from the Cdfm study group. I'm going to be going over the federal budget process as it pertains to Cdfm Module 2.1. I reviewed the last video and I think it's important for me to update, so this will be the update for that particular slide because I want to make sure that you understand the process. Everything begins with understanding the operational chain of command. That means priority for resources goes from the president to the SecDef to the combatant commanders. So whenever you need manpower, you need equipment, you need funding, money, the resources, the requirements of the combatant commanders take priority over anything else. So it's important in understanding the federal budget process as we move forward in this Cdfm study guide. So the members, which is what this is, the members of the National Security Council is the president, the vice president, the SecDef, Secretary of State, Secretary of Energy, Secretary of Treasury, and they also have advisors, namely the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff and the Director of Intelligence. So they are the highest federal body of leaders that get together. They determine the strategy, the posture, the threat that the country faces. And once they've done their analysis, they publish what's called the National Security Strategy. This document is what you can compare to a big op order. Since most of us are familiar with Department of Defense and the way how it functions, we typically get our orders through a systematic process. And so the op order process is where your higher command tells the subordinates, this is the mission, this is what we need to get done, and this is what I need you to do. So from the highest federal level, that is the function of the National Security Council and the publishment, and they publish the National Security Strategy document. That's our big op order for the DoD to take to determine what defense-related things are required from the National Security Council. So then the DoD takes the big op order, the National Security Strategy, and determine what DoD level strategy needs to be. So as you can see here, you have the National Defense Strategy is what the DoD publishes after it gets the information from here, pulls out the DoD related information, and it publishes the National Defense Strategy. And in order to meet that strategy, the DoD uses 3 decision support systems that we're going to talk about. And throughout the Cdfm, whether it's module 1, 2, 3, or 4, you have to understand these 3 systems. So we're going to talk about each one. JCIDS, Joint Capabilities Integration and Development System. Ppbe, Planning, Programming, Budgeting, and Execution, and the Defense Acquisition System, the DAS. So how does this work? Once the DoD determines what its strategy needs to be, then JCIDS is kicked off. The system is kicked off because once you identify what you need to do, you need to determine what capabilities you have in place to do that. Likewise, you need to know what are your capability gaps. You know what you need to do. Do you have the manpower? Do you have the resources? Do you have the equipment to fulfill that strategy? So the JCIDS process is a bunch of analysis is done, war gaming for lack of a better word, on behalf of the warfighter. So joint meaning representative from Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, and all the services participate in the JCIDS process to identify capability gaps. It's a systematic method used by the Joint Chiefs of Staff to assess the gaps in military warfighting capabilities. And how do they do that? They look at .mlpf. What that means, they look at the different areas. Where is that capability gap? Is it in doctrine? Do we just need to change our doctrine? Organization, training, material, leader development. We need to develop our stronger leaders. They need some additional training. Personnel, we need more people. Facilities. A material solution is what triggers the acquisition system. So what that is telling you is when they do the J6 process and they look at the .mlpf here, if it's anything else other than material, it simply triggers the Ppbe process you see here. If it is a material, the M in the .mlpf, that triggers the acquisition system. We need to go procure things, buy things, develop things. So we talked about the advisor up here to the National Security Council. The chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff provides the SecDef. So remember, let's go back up here. Your president is a civilian, your SecDef is a civilian, and combatant commanders are in uniform. Well, there's no in-between in the operational chain of command. The SecDef is a civilian trying to communicate with military members. How does he or she do that? They do that by communicating their orders through the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff. It is his job to translate what the president, the SecDef, the National Security Council needs to do, wants to do, to those combatant commanders. Who's in charge of JCIS, Joint Capabilities Integration and Development System? That's our first system. Who's in charge of it? The vice chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff. He's in charge of JCIS, and he does not do it alone. Excuse me. He does not do this alone. He has the JROC, Joint Requirement Oversight Council. So the vice chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff is the executor. He's the one in charge of JCIS. He has another role. He's the chairman of the JROC. That's the council, that's the body of people that help him do all this warfighter analysis over our strategy, our mission, what we need to get done. And he has a third role. He is the vice chairman of the Defense Acquisition Board with the USD for Acquisition and Sustainment. So what this is saying is this same vice chairman who's in charge of this system, he's the co-chairman of this third system, DAS. All right. The second system is the Ppbe, since most of us participate in this one form or the other. Planning, programming, budgeting, execution. Ppbe, what does it do? It determines how, when to pay for the resources. So whatever we need, whatever resources we need, the process we use to get approval from Congress to get those resources is the Ppbe process within the Department of Defense. So remember our combatant commanders from up here, right? Operational chain of command, they have priority for resources. So when those combatant commanders identify what they need, their requirements, they issue IPLs, Integrated Priority Lists. That is where these combatant commanders annotate. They let their higher command know, I am in charge of Northcom, Southcom, or whatever area, and we need these resources. They send a copy to the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, the SecDef, and the military department responsible for that resource, the Army, the Navy, because combatant commanders do not own the resources. They're just in charge of a geographic area. So the IPLs go up to the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff. The chairman then gives his assessment. Again, it got to go through the senior military uniform guy before it gets to the SecDef. He's got to translate it to make sense to our civilian leaders. So the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, he publishes the National Military Strategy. Once we identify what the DoD needs to get done, then the chairman needs to annotate what the military strategy is going to be. He also looks at the requirements for the combatant commanders and provide an assessment and recommendation to the SecDef. So when you are asked who is the author, who writes the National Military Strategy, the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff writes the National Military Strategy. He sends it, but we don't get the policy from him. He sends it to the SecDef. Then the SecDef is the one that sends out all these policies. Defense planning guidance, joint military strategy, homeland security, all of those, that's what's in here. Joint planning guidance and all of that we get from the SecDef. So remember, I couldn't put everything on this slide because there's so much more. So I just use it more as a talking point to get you to start thinking of those particular areas. So the first phase of Ppbe, the USD for policy, Under Secretary of Defense for Policy, is in charge of the planning phase of Ppbe. The purpose of the planning phase is to develop the plan to meet the National Defense Strategy. Remember this strategy? Everything got to be tied in place. Planning meets the National Defense Strategy. The National Defense Strategy will meet the National Security Strategy, keeping it all in line. So in the planning phase of Ppbe, you have the various plans that's going on to move forward. What do we need to do? How long is it going to take? What resources do we need? How many people? What type of equipment? Those are all the things that are being put in place in the planning phase. Towards the end of the planning phase of Ppbe, you have guidance on the next phase, which is programming. You get guidance for the budget phase, because if you're familiar with Ppbe, simultaneously the programming and the budgeting phase occurs. Everything overlaps. It never stops for us. It always overlaps. So the DCAPE, Director of Cost Assessment and Program Evaluation, which you'll see in a minute, is in charge of programming. So we get guidance from him. We get budget estimate submission guidance from the USD Comptroller, Under Secretary of Defense Comptroller. At the end of the planning phase, we get the Defense Planning Guidance, DPG. So we get the guidance on what we need to do to prep for the next phase, sent out to the agencies from the DCAPE and the USD Comptroller. And at the end of the planning phase from the SecDef, we get the DPG. Programming phase, the USD level responsibility falls on the DCAPE, Director of Cost Assessment and Program Evaluation. The programming phase translates the plan into allocation of resources. We need to let it make sense. We got a plan. We got a bunch of things we need to do. But the next question is, what do we need to fulfill those plans? So what are the resources necessary? And oh, by the way, we know we're not going to get all the resources we need. So in the programming phase, this is the opportunity to prioritize those resources. So again, with our combatant commanders, this is what it's saying here. They submit their requirements to the component responsible for inclusion in the POM. So what this is saying is combatant commanders do not do their own program objective memorandum. That's what it's called, the POM. So they don't do their own POM. Again, I told you, they don't own anything. So whatever they need, their requirements is published in the IPL, and whatever they need included in the POM, the next POM, for out years, they have to submit it to the component. And also it has to go through the chairman again. The chairman gives his assessment, recommendation on the requirements for the POM from the combatant commanders and the components. Got to make sure everything is in line. The DCAPE, the FYDP, Future Year Defense Program. So as we're going through this Ppbe process, starting with the programming phase, the DCAPE here is also responsible for updating the Future Year Defense Program. So the idea behind this slide is after you've reviewed the material in 2.1 is then come back to the slide and you should be able to walk through the information covered in 2.1. So DCAPE, the POM goes up, it goes through several decision-making bodies. 3-star group, DMAG, SecDef, they review the documents. They make recommendation, they make approval, and whatever they're not allowed to approve, they send up to the SecDef for final decision. The final document in the programming phase is the Program Decision Memorandum. Program Decision Memorandum. It starts with program, so it should help you to remember. Defense Planning Guidance is the last document in planning. Program Decision Memorandum is the last document from the DoD in the programming phase. What that means is once the final decision is made in that phase, it is published in that document. At the same time, while this is going on, the programming side of the house, the budget side is going on, budget estimate submissions. At the DoD level, the Undersecretary of Defense Comptroller is in charge of the budgeting phase of Ppbe. The purpose of the budgeting phase is to translate these programs. Now we got particular categories of things we plan to do, we want to do. Now we need to take those programs and translate them into appropriation language. Translate them so that when we send them forward to Congress, Congress understands what it is that we need or what it is that we're asking for. This thing looks crazy. I'm distracting myself. All right, so from the combatant commander level to the organization, they submit their budget estimates to the component for inclusion into the component's budget estimate submission. Send it up through the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff and his joint staff. So remember, it's not just the chairman. The chairman have a joint staff under him from each of the services. He's just a senior military person, military advisor. That again goes up to the DoD level through those decision-making forums. The DCAPE is updating the Future Year Defense Program. And in the budgeting phase, the USD Comptroller also has a system that he updates. It's called the Comptroller Information System, the CIS. The final document in the budgeting phase of Ppbe is the Program Budget Decision. As remember, we're putting budget towards the program. Program Budget Decision, PBD. Then once those final numbers are published, it gets sent to OMB, Office of Management and Budget, and a copy goes down so that everyone has visibility. All the subordinate gets a copy of the Program Decision Memorandum and the Program Budget Decision. Office of Management and Budget is the resource manager for the president or the executive branch. So remember, the budget goes through the executive branch, even though it's the president, goes to Congress. So all of these, what's listed here, you might not be able to read them as good, but what it is like when it gets to Congress, the first thing Congress does, the first phase is the budget resolution process. That's the process where Congress determines what guidelines, what limitations they're going to use when they look at the president's budget, the PresBud. So this is a joint action, it's concurrent. It does not go to the president to become rule or law. The next phase is the authorization phase. The purpose of the authorization phase is to authorize the program. So the programs that we asked for here, now Congress has to look at them in the authorization phase. So you need to know which House and which Senate is responsible for budget resolution phase, which is the House Budget Committee and the Senate Budget Committee. The authorization phase is the House Armed Services Committee and the Senate Armed Services Committee in Congress is responsible for the authorization. At the end of the authorization phase, that bill needs to go to the president for signature for it to become law. When the House reviews the authorization, the Senate reviews the same thing. When they have disagreements, they come together in what's called a conference committee. And the purpose of the conference committee is for them to work out their differences. Then they can publish the bill in one form. That one document is what goes to the president for the president to sign. So once Congress finalizes everything here, authorization goes to the president for the president's signature. That becomes law. The same thing with the appropriation process. The House Appropriation Committee and the Senate Appropriation Committee is responsible for the appropriations process. The process goes through the same House floor, Senate floor, differences come together in the conference or third chamber, work their differences out till they get one bill. Then they publish, go back to their floors in like form. That one document is enrolled and it goes to the president for the president to sign. What happens when it gets to the president? So all of that I'm talking about here. I'm recapping everything I know, what happens once it gets to Congress, once it gets back to the president. Because although the executive branch, the press bud, sends it to Congress, the budget, that particular authorization and the appropriation, which is where we get our budget authority, where we get our funding from, has to go back to the president for the president to sign. What options does the president have? The president can sign the bills and it becomes law. He cannot sign it and allow it to become law anyway. If Congress is in session and the president gets a bill and does not sign it within 10 days, that bill automatically becomes law. Or he can veto. Veto simply means the president looks at the entire bill. He does not agree with certain portions of it. He has to send back veto the entire bill to whoever originated that bill. He cannot line item veto anymore. We can't do that anymore. President Clinton in the 90s was allowed to mark through areas in the bill that he didn't agree with, and then sign it into law. That was deemed unconstitutional. So now they have to veto the entire bill. Or you can do a pocket veto. A pocket veto simply means that the president receives the bill, he does not sign it within 10 days. It does not become law because Congress is not in session. All right, so you see how much information I can recap just for what happens when it gets to Congress. All right, so once Congress appropriates, now we have money because Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution says no money shall be drawn out the Treasury unless we have an appropriation law in place. So the government will shut down if we don't have an appropriation law or a continuing resolution, the stopgap. So once Congress appropriates the money, two things happen. The legal action is the Treasury issues Treasury warrants. That's notification that the accounts are ready to be charged. We've received the law. We know that the appropriation law is in effect. So now you can charge. That's the legal part. Treasury issues Treasury warrant. The second thing that happens on the Office of Management and Budget side, OMB begins the apportionment process. So what happens is the agencies like DOD has to submit an SF-132 document to request the DOD or defense budget from Office of Management and Budget. OMB does not automatically send them their money. They have to submit the SF-132 within 10 days of that appropriation enactment, and then OMB has 30 days to send them their apportionment. So anytime you hear the word apportionment, that is OMB apportioning funds to the agencies. So we said Congress appropriates, OMB apportions. So what do we get from the DOD? How do we get our funding? We get allotments from the DOD. Those are 3 A words you need to know. So part of the execution means that we're monitoring the execution of the plan. All of this. So we said we made sure everything was in line. We asked for the money for it, and now someone needs to monitor internally. That is the responsibility also of the USD Comptroller, budgeting and execution, monitoring the plan to see how we're spending. Along that same line, a part of that monitoring is quarterly, the agencies have to submit an SF-133 execution document to OMB. We got to explain. All right. Second quarter, you said you were going to spend $5 million. You only spend $3 million. What happened? What's going to happen? Are you going to spend the money? So that is done in the execution phase. What I wanted to show here is you have different types of funding, annual or 1-year appropriations. That simply means that they're available for new contracts, new obligations. MILPERS, O&M, they're 1 year. Incremental funding is RDT&E, incrementally as we need it. Okay, we're doing a research. RDT&E, Research Development Technology Equipment, 2-year appropriation. Full funding, if I'm going to procure, because these are talking over $250,000 for procurement, Milcon, usually in the millions. So full funding, 3-year appropriation versus a 5-year. You also have, I forgot to put the shipbuilding conversion Navy, which is actually a procurement, but when you're building a ship, you probably need like a 5-year appropriation. So shipbuilding conversion Navy is a 5-year appropriation. An appropriation is either current, that means we can spend it on new contracts, and every appropriation is expired for 5 years. So just because we are in we close a fiscal year, in most people's eyes, like, okay, that fiscal year is gone. But if you're a financial manager, you know that we're still closing out books within 5 years. Like it's currently 2022, and we're in the process of still closing out bills from 2017, 18, 19, 20. We work so consistently. That's the kind of work that we do, is we're still so expired for every appropriation, even if they're 1, 2, 3, or 5 years. That means they're good for new contract for 5 years. Then the next 5 years, I can do upward and downward adjustments. That means I already have a contract in place, and either they're returning funding or they need additional funding to complete the job. Then after this expired process is over, the appropriation is closed. Those funds are often returned to the miscellaneous receipt in the Treasury. So after an appropriation is finally closed, the funds are returned to the Treasury in the miscellaneous receipts. However, if we get a bill in, there's a statutory authority under that closed appropriation bill that says we can use up to 1% of current appropriation to pay a bill. So if you get a bill, and so it might be 6 years later, and you have the funding with current appropriation, you have it available, you can pay that bill. So the third system, JCIDS, Ppbe, and the Defense Acquisition System. So what triggers the Defense Acquisition System? I repeat again, when they review the .mlpf up here, doctrine, organization, training, and so forth, the M is material. Material is aircraft, large vehicles, Humvees. Back in the day, we used to have 5 tons, military vehicles, systems, like computer systems, those big ticket items. So the defense acquisition system is triggered like DTS, Defense Travel System, since most people are familiar with that. That most likely went through this process, defense acquisition system. That is how we buy or develop what we need to fill that capability gap. So material solution triggers the defense acquisition system. Defense Acquisition Board. So just like the JROC had, the JCIDS had the JROC Council or Board, in the Defense Acquisition System, they have a board called the Defense Acquisition Board. The DoD Senior Acquisition System for near-term needs. The person in charge of the Defense Acquisition System is the Undersecretary of Defense Acquisition and Sustainment, USDANS. If you have older study guides, older than, I would say, because this one's out of the 2020 book, I think the 2018 still says USDATNL, so make sure you get the updated. It's Undersecretary of Defense Acquisition and Sustainment. He's the chairman of the Defense Acquisition Board. I added the vice chairman here again because remember, vice chairman is in charge of JCIDS, but he also sits on the Defense Acquisition Board here. So he's the co-chairman. So he's the executor of JCIDS, chairman of the JROC Council, and vice chairman of the Defense Acquisition Board with the USDANS. What they do, his job is to tie long-range and near-term needs. Long-range goal and near-term needs, trying to synchronize things to make sure we get what we need, but it have to be in a path to reach our long-term goals. I'm trying to see, I think I had, yeah. So what I did over here on the bottom right is to show some changes that I noticed from the older study guides. We have the National Defense Strategy. In the older study guides, they talk about the QDR, Quadrennial Defense Review. Now we have the Program Decision Memorandum, PDM, replace RMD right here. So this and this used to be called RMD, Resource Management Decisions. Now you have, for the programming phase, it's Program Decision Memorandum, and for the budgeting phase is now Program Budget Decision. And I think in much older, this was the term, then they went to RMD, now we're back to these terms. Because I used to teach Ppbe at Fort Jackson, and I remember us teaching these then, and now we're back to these terms. Also some changes, the USDANS replaced the USDATNL, as I just mentioned. And the USD, Research and Engineering, this is a new one. It used to be the Chief Information Officer, or CIO. The USD Research and Engineering is the title of the individual who is the Chief Technology Officer at the DoD. They're the Chief Information Officer. So I annotated another change that I saw in Module 2.1. All right, so this was just a quick overview to help you to understand the Cdfm Module 2.1 Federal Budget Process. I thank you guys for stopping by. Please be sure to subscribe, like the videos, share it. Also, if you feel like you want to donate On the top right of my YouTube page, there's an opportunity for you to provide some donation. As you can see, it takes a lot of energy, resources for me to keep this page and keep the information up to date. But I know it's been beneficial because I do get a lot of feedback and people emailing me that they found the videos and they were able to earn their certification. So it continues to drive me to continue to do this process. So consider donating to the Cdfm study group to continue bringing these resources. This is Helen Thomas and the Cdfm study group. Thank you for stopping by, and I'll see you guys again next time.